The two people in this video are able-bodied people and are not normally in wheelchairs. For this analysis, there was a sign placed on the back of the wheelchair stating, Occupational Science Students Assessing Halifax Accessibility, not normally wheelchair-bound. Because they are not full-time wheelchair users, they did not have the necessary skills that one would develop over time, possibly making certain activities more difficult. Due to the extreme weather conditions, this sign was lost during the analysis. Instead, both students explained to observers what they were doing and that they were not normally in wheelchairs.
The goal of this analysis was to assess the physical accessibility of downtown Halifax for those in wheelchairs, specifically manual wheelchairs. Researchers took turns using the manual wheelchair in different spots around downtown Halifax. Looking at recreational and leisure occupations that a typical young adult may partake in, specifically, we looked at Halifax Seaport Market, Halifax Downtown Boardwalk, Niche Bar and Lounge, and Lululemon Spring Garden. We also assessed transportational occupations, specifically Metro Transit buses, sidewalks, and crosswalks.
Upon researching Halifax accessibility regulations for buildings, the majority of literature is focused on government buildings. There is a mention of public buildings, but there is no operational definition of what classifies as a public building. This is where ambiguity can lie for businesses such as restaurants or consumer goods stores. Nova Scotia does have regulations for buildings that require them to be accessible. The most applicable regulations will be presented here. Regulation 3823, areas requiring a barrier-free path of travel. A barrier-free path of travel should be provided at the entrance story and every story greater than 600 meters squared. To give context, this is about 1.5 times the size of a basketball court. This permits an area any smaller than this to not require a barrier-free path of travel. A barrier-free path of travel is also not required to floor levels not served by a passenger elevator, meaning that they already couldn't get there in the first place. The loophole here being, if you don't put a passenger elevator somewhere, there does not need to be a barrier-free path of travel in that area. You can make an area completely inaccessible and still be up to regulation.
Curbs are required to have a slope of no larger than 5 degrees, but this was not the case. Every curb varied in where it was located, how steep it was, and what lied beyond it. Most often the curb could have been estimated to be between 20 to 45 degrees in slope. Instead of being in line with the crosswalk, the curb could be found on the corner between the two crosswalks. This proved to be very dangerous as in order to enter or exit the curb, the user had to be in direct path of traffic on an incline. Often this led to the wheelchair rolling into the direction of oncoming traffic. Bathroom stalls are required to be self-closing, which again was not seen in any bathroom stalls evaluated. There is no mention of regulations for changing rooms in clothing stores, which led to difficulties in trying to close almost any stall door encountered.
I don't think I'm going to wash my hands.
Buildings are required to have space under the sinks such that a wheelchair should fit under it for up to 200 millimeters from the front edge. This again was not seen, as in some areas there was no space under the sink at all.
Injustice caused by struggles. Deprivation. Those in wheelchairs are deprived in the areas that they can visit. We tried to go to some of our favorite restaurants and bars downtown, but they proved not to be accessible. Either they did not have a ramp entrance, elevator, or a barrier-free pathway. The incline of hills made it so that certain streets could not be accessed by those in a manual wheelchair.
Marginalization. When traveling with transit, there is no choice in where to sit. You are required to sit rear-facing the entire bus who is facing forward. Exploring downtown Halifax as a wheelchair user requires assistance. There is no ability to be completely autonomous. A wheelchair user has no choice in which bathroom to use, meaning you may have to travel a further distance to reach an accessible bathroom.
Imbalance. Almost any task required significantly more effort. We were only outside for a total of an hour and a half and took turns in the wheelchair, but we were both exhausted by the end of it. Pushing yourself up the inclines was very physically taxing. Having to open and close doors required much more effort than usual. During the analysis, we often felt like completely giving up or being completely overwhelmed and tired.
Apartheid. The Nova Scotia Accessibility Directorate states that all persons with disabilities will receive equitable access to government buildings and public spaces. However, there's no mention of how they will hold these places accountable or measure accessibility. The only suggestion they make is that they are leading by example. Because there are no regulations concerning dressing rooms and clothing stores, there were no grab bars in the Lululemon dressing room. This would make it difficult for somebody in a wheelchair to maneuver themselves in a dressing room to try on clothing. When looking at this store, you'd expect their accessibility to be better because they are in a brand new building that was just completed.
Alienation. If you are someone who is wheelchair bound, it would be quite easy to feel alienated. When making plans with others, the location, time, and weather conditions would all need to be dictated by your accessibility needs. This not only limits your choices, but your friends' choices. When rear facing on the bus, every person stares or looks in your direction. It is easy to feel like a burden or lose your sense of self, as the bus driver has to go the extra measures and stop the bus for a few minutes just to allow you to get on and off. Furthermore, when wheeling across crosswalks, it takes longer in a wheelchair, especially on the steep inclines. This causes cars to have to stop for longer, and they also stare at you as you cross the path.
Why is this important? One of the major themes discovered through this analysis was that there are building regulations in place to allow for accessibility into these areas, but when it comes to environmental accessibility of sidewalks and walkways, there are none. By only focusing on building regulations, there is a disparity in how walkways are built. The accessibility of the route itself is completely overlooked. This makes it difficult for someone with mobility issues to travel to these places that are supposed to be accessible. Even within the regulations, there are loopholes that allow most buildings to remain inaccessible. This can be seen in small buildings not requiring to have barrier-free pathways, or buildings that do not have an elevator, not having to make their layout accessible. Within Halifax, this was seen in restaurants such as Your Father's Mustache, that has no elevator or barrier-free pathway.
Show your glasses right now. The most painful thing I've ever done in my life. I felt defeated. I felt watched.
Overall, it leaves behind feelings of being a burden, not only on your friends, but also on society. This was specifically seen when having to stop the bus driver to just get onto the bus, or holding up traffic when crossing the road. When waiting for transit in the downpour, the bus passed right by us. We had taken off the brakes of the wheelchair and even had moved forward towards the bus. We tried to wave, but the bus driver completely disregarded us and left us, wheelchair and all, in the pouring rain.
Show us your glasses right now. I actually literally can't see out. They're completely covered in rain, and without them I'm blind. So me trying to wheel in the rain while blind is a process. My hands hurt, my arms hurt, I can't see. I couldn't even leave my house if I was actually wheelchair bound. I couldn't go anywhere by myself.
This is a river.
We wanted to do this analysis to present to the general Halifax population. We hope that by sharing this video, the Halifax community will become more aware of inaccessibility and hold restaurants, public places, and the city accountable.
Conclusion. Overall, Halifax has regulations in place that allow for establishments to thrive off the loopholes, allowing them to remain inaccessible. There's no way currently to hold anyone accountable. The regulations do not include public walkways, making downtown Halifax extremely inaccessible. For a city that prides themselves in being accessible, the only accessible options are those that lead to inequities.
Woohoo!